Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to this, the third in this calendar year of the IGS lectures, in which we have leading specialists from around the world address key issues in global governance. If there is one country in Latin America that has been at the very center of international tensions in the course of the past 50 years, it has been Cuba, of course. Most famously, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When John Kennedy was asked after that how close we had been to nuclear war on that occasion, he answered between one and three and even, which is pretty close. I suppose most of you would agree. The Cuban Missile Crisis gave rise to such an enormous literature that there is in fact one scholarly article entitled "Why We Must Stop Studying the Cuban Missile Crisis." A leading political scientist, Graham Allison, wrote his Harvard dissertation on it, later turned it into a highly successful book, Essence of Decision, which triggered a new paradigm in the study of UN's foreign policy, namely the bureaucratic politics model, which in turn became the founding paradigm of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, when Graham Allison became its first dean. So developments in Cuba have had a significant impact on the growth and development of the study of international relations and political science more generally. And if there has been one scholar that has been at the forefront of it, it has been Professor Jorge Dominguez, who is here with us in his first visit to Waterloo and to CIGI, who after getting his BA at Yale has spent the last 40 years at Harvard, first as a graduate student, later as a professor of government, and now as the Vice Provost for International Affairs, as well as the Antonio Madero Professor of Mexican and Latin American Politics and Economics. In the span of 10 years, Professor Dominguez published 3 massive volumes on Cuban politics, his Cuban trilogy, if you will: Cuba, Order and Revolution, Insurrection or Loyalty, the Breakdown of the Spanish-American Empire, and the closing one, Making the World Safe for Revolution, Cuba's Foreign Policy, all by Harvard University Press, in addition to a very large number of articles and book chapters. Since then, he has published some 20 other books on inter-American relations, democratization, and Mexican politics, among other subjects. The list of books is so long that in his CV, Professor Dominguez refers to the principal books that he has published. Not very many people can do that. And I understand his next book, this time in Spanish, is on Cuban foreign policy. So he has returned to his first love, as it were. In addition, on the side, as it were, he has discharged many other professional duties, like being president of the Latin American Studies Association, the leading professional association of Latin Americanists, the Institute of Cuban Studies, producing documentaries for PBS, and being a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine, and otherwise enhancing our knowledge about the Americas. I first met Professor Dominguez in Washington, D.C. some 30 years ago, when I was at the Wilson Center, and he had a very active presence in the seminars and workshops that we put together at the Latin American program there, especially a project, and we were recalling this last evening, on US-Caribbean relations that turned out very well. And we have kept intermittently in touch ever since. It is a measure of how far we have backslided, though, in academic exchanges between the United States and Cuba, that in 1991, when in the midst of the special period that Cuba was going through, after the fall of the wall and the dramatic drop in trade and aid from the Soviet Union, I put together the annual convention of the Caribbean Studies Association in Havana, and I invited Professor Dominguez to give a keynote address, which he very kindly and brilliantly did. At the time, the event was covered by CNN and the Miami Herald. I think a summary version of Professor Dominguez's paper was published in the opinion pages of the Herald. The meeting was a great success, with hundreds of US scholars participating in it. Almost 20 years later, holding such a conference in Havana with hundreds of US academics would be impossible. But rather than progress, we seem to be regressing in this matter. President Obama has taken steps to normalize relations with Cuba, including the lifting of the limit on the number of times Cuban Americans can visit Cuba, as well as on the remittances that they can send. A number of talks between the State Department and the Cuban counterparts have taken place. The OAS, as you may know, last June also lifted the 1962 resolution that suspended Cuba from the organization, something that has led to a vigorous debate, although Cuba has not requested so far to rejoin the organization. The question then is, where do we go from here? Will it be possible to have Cuba formally rejoin the Inter-American family of nations in the near future? By this I mean the OAS, the IDB, fully normalized relations with the United States, in other words, being accepted as just another regular Latin American state. The newly re-elected Secretary General of the OAS, when he was recently asked about the lifting of the 1962 resolution about it, said, yes, well, as you may recall, that resolution referred to the danger that was posed by Cuba because it was allied to the Sino-Soviet alliance. And he said, well, you know, the Soviet part of this no longer exists. And China has very good relations with the United States. So the notion that Cuba should still be somehow held accountable for being part of the Sino-Soviet alliance sounds a bit odd in this day and age. Will the Obama administration dare to go further? Will Raul Castro push for some opening up of the Cuban regime, or will we just see a freezing of the present status quo? To answer those questions, we have today Professor Domínguez with us. Professor Domínguez.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure whether I want to start here or around, but let me begin here and move back to the podium. I'm really delighted to be here. This is some of those things, a splendid building, and especially to be here with Jorge Jaime, who, as he said, I met about 3 decades ago. You want me to turn it on? I hadn't turned it on. So let me just say again that I'm delighted to be here, particularly with Jorge Jaime, but also with others with whom I've been friends for a while. One way to sort of get to the present, although what I want to do in my remarks is to try to work you through a stylized historical account of the question, because I think it's analytically interesting in many ways, is to try to think of what was it that the Organization of American States and the various governments that were actively involved agreed to last June when, as Jorge Jaime indicated, the resolution that was first approved in 1962 was lifted. In effect, what they agreed to borrow from a rather different area of human experience, could be called don't ask, don't tell. And so Cuba does not ask to become an active member of the Organization of American States, and the member states do not tell it that it cannot be an active member of the OAS. That is what came out of that meeting. It is an example of an elaborate set of negotiations, which I'm not trying to trivialize by formulating it in this way, but to indicate that in fact both the process that led to it was subtle and the result that thus far has come out of it is subtle. And so what I want to do over the next few minutes is to work back to saying more about this way to characterize, because I think in fact it is the way it has come out, that Cuba does not ask and the members do not keep it out. So the story does begin in 1962 in the middle of a Cold War. And in order to try to think about both the origins and the evolution of the process, I just want to make sure that you realize that the topic that Jorge Jaime has given me really includes 3.5 different topics. So if one thinks about the Inter-American system, you can think about the Inter-American system either in capital letters or in small letters. In small letters, all that it means, it's a system of relations, of behaviors in which governments and peoples and enterprises engage in over a period of time. The Inter-American System in capital letters is a set of institutions like the Organization of American States, a variety of political, military agreements. It includes the Pan American Health Organization that does double duty as the OAS and the United Nations wing of international healthcare cooperation. And I will be referring at various times about these two ways to think about it. One is on capital letters, the institutions, and the other one is just the straightforward international relations in the hemisphere. The third topic is the Cuban government's own international behavior. What did it do? How did it change? And how did its behavior connect to these two other topics, both the institutions and the actual relations? And the half topic is the United States in the background, since obviously it's difficult to talk about any of the first three topics without being conscious that the United States is larger than just one member of the OAS. That its formal vote may only be one, but its clout, it's somewhat greater. At the beginning of the 1960s, there was a very close correspondence between the institutional side of the relations of the Western Hemisphere and the actual pattern of relations. It was not just a set of international institutions as if one were observing the United Nations. It was also an alliance. The OAS is founded in the late 1940s, not simply as a regional wing of the United Nations, but also very much as a way to organize the countries of the Western Hemisphere as U.S. allies in the Cold War. And the resolution that is adopted in 1962 that is finally suspended a few months ago is a Cold War resolution. The reason Cuba was excluded, as Jorge indicated, are Cold War reasons. It's important to bear in mind a reason why Cuba was not excluded in 1962. It was not excluded on the grounds that it may not have been a constitutional democracy. And it could not have been excluded on the grounds that it was not a constitutional democracy, since some of those that voted to exclude it were dictators, Stroessner in Paraguay, Somoza in Nicaragua, and many others. So at the origin of the exclusion, the kinds of considerations that bear on democratic constitutionalism, that bear on the circumstances today, were simply not salient. Cuban behavior in the course of the 1960s does affect how the institutions of the system respond to it and how Cuba relates at the behavioral level in the greater relations in the Americas. So in 1964, and again in 1967, the institutions, not just the United States, but the collective institutions of the system imposed sanctions on Cuba. And they do so because Cuba had been supporting active insurgencies in a number of Latin American countries. In the 64 and the 67 cases, was specifically so in Venezuela, where the facts are not in dispute. Indeed, in 1967, there is a published resolution of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party expressing its pride that it had indeed sent weapons to insurgents in Venezuela, that it actually sent Cubans to join in combat with some of the insurgents in Venezuela. So it was very much a Cuba engaged in combat with U.S. allies and with the institutions mirroring a system that was focused on a Cold War. Cuba engaged in active support of insurgencies during this period in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Bolivia. Che Guevara dies in Bolivia with a group of fellow insurgents who were mainly not Bolivians. And it included other Cubans, included Cubans who at the time were active members of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party. By the time you get to the early 1970s, at these three levels, the institutions of the system, the actual relations in the system, and Cuban foreign policy, all change. They change concurrently and they change in the same direction. The changes begin because of domestic political changes in Peru, domestic political changes in Chile, and in the others. They all begin, one by one, to establish either commercial, that's how Chile began, or diplomatic relations, that's how others began. Cuba responds to these constructively. It moderates its foreign policy, and in many of these instances changes wide aspects of its behavior. The institutions of the inter-American system in 1975 lift the collective sanctions, not the exclusion of Cuba, but the collective sanctions that had imposed during the previous decade. And the lifting of the collective sanctions takes place with the support of the United States government under Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. For the most part, the U.S. objective was to get Cuba out of the content of its relations with the Latin American countries. It wanted to be able to forget about Cuba. It wouldn't, but that was the temporary objective. It wanted to end Cuba as a third party in bilateral U.S. relations with individual Latin American countries. What is interesting also about the 1975 resolution is that the question whether Cuba was or was not a constitutional democracy was once again not at issue. Those of you who have studied Latin American politics know that the 1970s is a tragic decade where one by one there is a spread of authoritarian rule throughout Latin America. And so the fact that Cuba was not a constitutional democracy in 1975, what you get is a shrug of the shoulders from Brazilian military rulers, or a shrug of the shoulders from military rulers or old-fashioned dictators throughout the hemisphere. The Soviet Union had actually encouraged Cuba to moderate its policy along this way, so the Soviet Union's own behavior is part of this concurrent change in a similar direction. And once again, the actual relations of the system and the institutions of the system are mirroring each other. They mirrored it in Cold War confrontation in the 60s. They now mirror in détente in the mid-1970s. It is in the 1980s when you get, I think for the first time since the foundation of these inter-American institutions, it is in the 1980s when you get for the first time a divergence between the institutions on the one hand and what is actually happening in relations between the states in the Americas. So in the 1980s, Cuba is not active in the OAS. It is not a member of the Inter-American Development Bank. It is certainly not a member of the military organizations that also are part of the structure of the institutions. But Cuba begins to collaborate with individual Latin American states on a number of significant foreign policy initiatives. For example, Cuba, the governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Mexico all give material assistance, not just symbolic encouragement, not just cheering from the sidelines. All three give material assistance to the Sandinista insurgency fighting to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua in the late 1970s. The Cuban assistance was probably the most effective, but the Venezuelan government of Carlos Andrés Pérez and the Mexican government of José López Portillo also were giving material assistance. Yet another example, perhaps a little more surprising, when in 1982 war breaks out between Argentina and the United Kingdom. To the best of my knowledge, Cuba was the only country that actively considered, in conversations with the Argentine right-wing military government at the time, to deploy Cuban troops to fight on the Argentine side. So this is another aspect of Cuban engagement with, in that case, one Latin American government in ways that would have been unthinkable years before. In Central America, as both domestic and international wars spread out throughout the decade of the 1980s, Cuba was one of the key actors, and it was one of the key actors that engaged not only the Central American countries, the United States, the Soviet Union, but also many others, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, that attempted actively to mediate through what at the time was called the Contadora Group. The Contadora Group would give birth years later to what today is known as the Rio Group, but still very much Cuba as an active member in this system of relations. The institutions of the system weaken at this time, at least in part because Cuba is now building strategic alliances with some of the members, so the institutions are not reflecting this much more dynamic and unorthodox in the history of these international relations during the course of the 1980s. The institutions have also changed because the Latin American members of the OAS were no longer willing to permit the United States to construct a majority, or either simple majority or a two-thirds majority, because they knew that's how the United States had bullied some of them decades before. That was part of the story of the 1962 resolution that had suspended Cuba. It was how the United States got to invade the Dominican Republic in 1965. So by the 1980s, the OAS had moved away from roll call votes to consensus. And what consensus means, in effect, is unit veto. If I'm not a member of the consensus, or a few of us are not members of the consensus, essentially you paralyze the organization. And one of the ways to think about the OAS in the 1980s is paralysis. On the U.S. side, the Reagan administration was not particularly interested in multilateral institutions, and therefore it was not especially troubled that these institutions had weakened themselves. And the South American countries were in the midst of significant transition and, for the most part, inattentive to the fate of these institutions. So you get both a divergence between the actual behavior in international relations and the institutions of the system, and you get a weakening of these multilateral institutions themselves. In the 1990s, you have a convergence between the actual relations and the level of the institutions. But you have this convergence now coming from a different direction. By 1990, with the changes in changes in the political regime in Paraguay and in Chile, away from authoritarian rule, you have a South American initiative that Canada will support and the United States will support as well, to turn the institutions of the inter-American system for the first time into a democratic alliance. Not a Cold War alliance, the Cold War is coming to an end in Europe, but a democratic alliance. It is formalized in a resolution 1080, adopted at a meeting in Santiago, Chile in 1991, and it will culminate 10 years later, literally on September 11, 2001, when the Democratic Charter is signed. The idea is that the institutions of the inter-American system will defend the existence of democratic constitutionalism in each and every country in the Americas and commit themselves to procedures to compel them to act if a constitutional democracy is threatened by, say, a military coup. Part of the important history, both for the institutions and for the actual relations in the Western Hemisphere, is that the OAS did that, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less so, in Haiti, in Peru, in Guatemala, in Paraguay, during the course of the 1990s. It is part of the process that will lead to the end of domestic and international wars in Central America, and also in Central America, transitions away from authoritarian regimes. For Cuba, the third level that I'm analyzing, the international system changed dramatically. The world, as Cuban leaders had known it, came to an end. The Soviet Union disappeared, and as Thucydides in classical Greece was the first to note, in circumstances like this, small, weak countries are compelled to adjust, and Cuba was compelled to adjust. It shifted from having been a significant world power in the 1970s and 1980s, having deployed several hundreds of thousands of troops in a country that even today only has a population of 11 million, several hundreds of thousands of troops all over the world. At one point, simultaneously, 24 different countries had Cuban military missions, and to have won 3 wars on African soil when the Soviets could not win in Afghanistan and the United States could not win in Vietnam. Having been that, it now just became one more poor island under the Caribbean sunshine. But in the 1990s, there is another dimension of Cuban international behavior that begins to shift in ways that approximate convergence with some of the goals of the institutions of the inter-American system. I'd said at the start of my remarks that the institutions had reflected the Cold War, that the institutions, no matter the occasional democratic declaration, really were not about democratic political systems because so much of Latin America was under dictatorship. But these institutions from the 1940s onward did work and were rather successful in many instances at interstate peace, and were also often active with varying success at trying to bring about domestic political settlements in instances of civil war. And so the Cuban contribution in the 1990s, starting in the early 1990s, is to contribute significantly to the negotiations that bring to an end the civil and international wars in El Salvador, with the settlement signed in 1992, and that in 1996, the same process, active Cuban engagement in facilitating the negotiations to the peace settlement there, including active engagement between Cuba and the United States to bring about this peace settlement. Cuba had not behaved in this way before. In the United States government, it has, to the best of my knowledge, never gotten any credit for having contributed in this way to the settlement. Cuba had done similar kinds of, had engaged in similar ways for settlements to the conflicts in Southern Africa in the late 1980s. But it is that shift. It is also in the 1990s when one witnesses the evolution of newer groups that begin to compete with the long previously established institutions of the inter-American system. So there come to be not just the OAS, but what had emerged from the Contadora process of negotiations in Central America into the Rio Group as an independent entity of the larger Latin American countries engaging in summit meetings with each other. Spain and Portugal take the initiative to begin to organize and pay for what come to be the Ibero-American summits that bring together the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries of the Americas, but not the English or French-speaking countries of the Americas. This shift in the general arena of institutions will continue to build, and it's part of the story of the most recent period. Part of what is interesting about the signing of the Democratic Charter on September 11 of 2001 is that it is the end of a period, even though the Charter was thought of as the launching of a new era. It is in the years that follow the adoption of the Charter, not caused by the Charter, caused by other things, but in the years that follow its adoption, that you get a new divergence between the old established institutions of the inter-American system on the one hand and the actual system of international relations in the Americas, as well as further changes in how Cuban foreign policy interacts with those two levels. Formally, the institutions are even more strongly committed to the defense of constitutional democracy. That's what the Charter is about. As a matter of fact, the Bush administration, within a year of the signing of the Charter, abandons its core principle, namely the defense of constitutional rules, when it, at a minimum, encourages and perhaps actively supports the 2002 military coup attempt against President Chavez in Venezuela. You get an odd convergence between the U.S. and Venezuelan government then. The U.S. had just demonstrated that it was prepared to resort yet again to the military coups that the institutions of the system and the democratic charter had been trying to banish forever. And President Chavez's response to the 2000 coup and other events is to make Venezuelan constitutionalism weaker and weaker, and to begin to expunge the liberal dimensions of what had been Venezuelan democracy. So it's an odd agreement on moving away from core ideas of the charter, albeit for different reasons. Cuba begins to find new allies not committed to constitutional liberal democracy in the Americas, Chavez in the first instance, and Cuba is blessed yet again by assistance from Washington through a Bush administration that manages brilliantly to alienate just about everybody else in the hemisphere. What is interesting as this political space opens up for almost anything that the Cuban government wants to do is that Cuba's choice of foreign policy for the decade that has just ended emphasizes its role as a good citizen. Let me say a word about the good citizen dimension of Cuban foreign policy, for which it also doesn't often get, at least in Washington, very much credit. So it begins on the other event that happened on September 11, 2001. One was the Democratic Charter. The other event was the terrorist attack on New York City and Washington, D.C. Cuba's response on the day of the attack, even before it was entirely clear what was happening, was to condemn the attacks, to offer assistance, including in what I thought was a very well-formulated comment, making available Cuban blood banks, not because there were not good blood banks in the United States, but because in emergencies like that, there's sometimes very rare blood types, and it's better, therefore, to have access to blood banks in other parts of the world. And perhaps most important in the context of an event that was still unfolding is to say that Cuban airports would be open to any aircraft, including U.S. Civilian or military aircraft that needed to make an emergency landing. Cuba soon, in the weeks that followed, ratified all 12 then existing United Nations anti-terrorism conventions. By the fall of 2002, Cuban government reversed the policy that it first developed in the 1960s with regard to nuclear weapons proliferation. In the 1960s, Cuba had refused to sign on to any of the international conventions of nuclear weapons proliferation because it had not seemed to ensure, above all, a guarantee that the U.S. government would not deploy nuclear weapons to its base near Guantanamo, Cuba. In the fall of 2002, Cuba ratifies the so-called Tlatelolco Treaty, which is an all-Latin American treaty to try to make Latin America a zone free from nuclear weapons. Cuba signs the UN-sponsored non-proliferation treaty, and so on. So terrorism is one, nuclear weapons is another. A third dimension of this Cuban good citizen behavior during the course of the last 10 years, for which, once again, it gets zero credit in the U.S. government, even zero credit thus far in the Obama administration, is building on the behavior that I described with regard to peace settlements in El Salvador and in Guatemala. So beginning under Conservative Party President Pastrana and continuing under President Uribe, perhaps a little more surprising that it has continued under President Uribe, Cuba has been a contributor to peace negotiations between the Colombian government on the one hand and one of the two of the insurgent organizations known by its acronym, the ELN, or the National Liberation Army, that has been the closest it was a Cuban ally decades ago, and it has retained cordial cooperative relations with the Cuban government. And so many of the negotiations, face-to-face negotiations between the Colombian government people and the ELN have taken place in Havana, because it is in Havana where in fact they can meet safely and speak frankly. Another dimension of Cuban good citizenship behavior during the past decade is that it has increased its commitment and its engagement to participate, for the most part, very effectively in international emergency relief operations, whether they are near, as in Haiti, or whether they are far, as in Pakistan. I'm talking a little longer than I would, so I'm going to shorten what I was going to say in some of these regards. But another one that is worth mentioning, because it had been in existence before, but it picks up salience during the course of the last 10 years, is international medical services on a graduated fee schedule that ranges of zero. Cuban healthcare personnel in Haiti do not charge Haitians anything for the services they provide, to international medical services that are services for export, as in the case of any other set of export services. Cuba is extraordinarily effective, different topic, in interdicting drug trafficking across its waters and its airspace. If you can recall the map of the Caribbean, Cuba is ideally located. If you are a drug trafficker, you know that it is terrific to go through Cuba. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, even during the Bush administration, described Cuba in ways that it describes none of the countries that surround it. No evidence of corruption, no evidence of actual official engagement in any of this activity, effective counter criminal measures throughout this region. And of course, it is equally important as part of this good citizen behavior that I am describing, what Cuba had stopped doing. It was no longer trying to support the overthrow of governments in Central America or in South America. It was no longer trying to bully others, as it had done in the past, and it was blessed with the good luck of having the Bush administration in office. So what opens in 2009 is this new window, a new window of the Obama administration, which thinks about Cuba in the context of U.S. Latin American relations, as Henry Kissinger did in 1975. Frankly, we'd rather not think about Cuba. It's not very important. That's what Kissinger thought in 75. That's what the new U.S. administration thinks about it now. Let's try to get it out of the context of our bilateral relations with name each and every one of the Latin American countries. And so that is one element of the strategy, to say if we can get rid of some of the debris of the past that is no longer helpful, and that irritates, we don't care that it irritates the Cubans, but it irritates Latin American governments with which the U.S. wants to have good relations, let's get rid of the debris of the past. On the Cuban side, President Fidel Castro relished from the beginning of the 1960s calling the OAS the U.S. Ministry of Colonies, and has continued to make very clear, now that he is no longer Cuba's president, but instead an op-ed columnist, through his periodic articles in the Cuban press and his blog, that Cuba should not join the OAS no matter what the OAS rules or resolutions or procedures may be. And the Cuban government, even before the OAS met to make the change, indicated that it would not join. And so there comes how I began my remarks, that don't ask, don't tell. Part of what made the agreement possible was the high certainty that if the OAS changed its rules, Cuba would not try to be seated at the table. And that made it easier, therefore, to change the rules. Part of what made it important to try to change the rules is that though Cuba did not want to be seated at the table, It did not want to be told that it could not be seated at the table. Part of the element of the question was not just the Latin American governments that were close to Cuba, but the Latin American governments at the time that were simply thinking about the new pattern of relations in the Americas that the Obama administration might make possible, wanted to de-Cold Warize the institutions of the inter-American system. And one of the ways to put an end of a Cold War in the internal guts of the institutions of the Americas was to terminate the episode that the 1962 suspension of Cuba had made possible. And so that was the settlement. The settlement was caused by a variety of considerations that now permit additional changes. What then lies ahead? First, there is a fairly clear barrier to Cuba's full reintegration into the old established institutions, both the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Development Bank. In order to be a Latin American member of the Inter-American Development Bank, you must be a member of the OAS. And so if the OAS says you must be a constitutional democracy to join, that affects both the OAS and the bank. So could Cuba join? Could Cuba take its seat at the table tomorrow? I think the answer is no. Cuba is not a constitutional liberal democracy. It is a single-party regime. In elections of the National Assembly, the number of candidates is equal to the number of seats. The government controls all the mass media. The Supreme Court does not rule in ways that give it a measure of independence on issues that affect politics or freedom of expression. The government has a very heavy hand on electorals and on the life of the universities, and if anything, a little bit heavier in recent months. There are, it is true, some bits of political liberalism or social liberalism that have emerged over the last couple of years under President Raul Castro. They're modest, but they're not insignificant. So Cuban newspapers now publish letters to the editor that criticize not the regime, but the actions of specific officials or agencies or the local grocery store. There have been important debates in which Cuban intellectuals have participated on a number of issues. There is a somewhat wider scope for discussions about the Cuban economy and what changes might be enacted, and perhaps most noteworthy, led by one of Raul Castro's children, Mariela Castro, there is a new set of initiatives to address the rights of homosexuals as Cuban citizens. But basically, Cuba does not meet the standards of the Democratic Charter to take its seat at the table of the OAS now. That doesn't mean that the institutions could not address Cuba and engage Cuba in ways that would be constructive and helpful in a variety of other ways. The institutions from the beginning were not just about democratic practice. Indeed, at the beginning, for the most part, they were not at all about democratic practice. That is a construction, a valued, in my view, normative construction from the early 1990s, but a more recent one. But the institutions have had a broad array of other commitments on issues of war and peace and on other services. Cuba could be engaged much more systematically than it has been, not just on an ad hoc basis, on cooperation on issues that deal with international terrorism. Cuba could certainly be engaged much more actively than it has been on international cooperation with regard to transnational criminal activities. Transnational crime is a big deal, not just with regard to drug traffic, and this is something where Cuba has at various times signaled clearly that it would welcome engagement, not just by the United States, but collectively. To take a third example, I mentioned in passing at the beginning, because I wanted to pick it up now, that PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, does double duty as a United Nations organization and as an institution in the inter-American system. And that is a very clever way to say, well, Cuba is already engaged in one of the important and rather more successful institutions of the inter-American system, and it would be a way to engage it more effectively. Similarly, with regard to international emergencies, instead of thinking of an international emergency as, oh my God, what a surprise, there was an earthquake. No, earthquakes happen, regrettably, all the time. Hurricanes happen, regrettably, every year, on schedule. The only thing that you don't know about a hurricane is the exact date and its exact trajectory, but you can be sure that there will be hurricanes in the Caribbean, at least one of which will hit Haiti sometime when hurricane season begins. And so take Haiti as an illustration, where Canada has had a long, sustained, and important engagement. I don't want to talk now about Canada, but want to talk about one of the odd features on the ground. There are thousands of U.S. personnel, hundreds of Cuban personnel. Neither government officially acknowledges that the people from the other are doing anything good. On the ground, they work very well with each other. U.S. troops have made it sure that they are prepared to provide security for Cuban healthcare personnel. Cuban healthcare personnel have made it clear that if some U.S. soldier, police officer, civilian needs health care, simply show up at a Cuban healthcare facility and she or he will get good care free of charge. It would be a lot more effective if one could imagine harnessing the already existing institution in healthcare in the Western Hemisphere to make one of the most effective providers of healthcare, not just in the Caribbean, but anywhere in the world, Cuba, cooperate effectively in the supply of these services, and also to do so, above all, in the context of emergencies. So we are, in some sense, in an odd circumstance. There is a clear divergence between the old established institutions in the system and their strength and commitment to upholding constitutional democracy, and the set of relations in the system where there are a variety of governments that have weakened their commitment to the liberal dimensions of constitutional democracies. This divergence is also apparent because Cuba, that had been hitherto entirely excluded, it's not now excluded in the same way, but it does not have a seat at the table, is and has been for quite now some time very actively engaged with other countries of the Americas. It would be possible to deepen, to foster elements of cooperation even within the institutions of the system that would include Cuba. And I mentioned crime, I mentioned providing international public goods with regard to emergencies, with regard to healthcare. What I don't know, but the other questions with which I want to end, is to what extent will there be, yet again, in the years ahead, a closer convergence between the institutions and the actual relations in the system. That doesn't seem to be in the cards for the time being. Would Cuba embrace liberal democracy? Doesn't seem to be in the cards anytime soon. Would the Cuban government be willing to engage, however, in partial ways in these task-specific, goal-oriented instances of cooperation that would use some, albeit not all, of the institutions of the inter-American system? Perhaps. Would the United States, Caribbean, Latin American members, and Canada be interested in doing so as well? Perhaps. And I hope that they would. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would now ask to invite you to say a few words.
Bravo, Maestro. My principal goal is not to get in the way of between you and Jorge Dominguez. Janet and I and David Welch regard George as a completely unique phenomenon a non-ideological Cuban-American student of Cuba, to the degree to which George carries that neutrality or empathy with all sides, I think it's unapproached in our experience anyway. This is one of the most polarizing issues for an American, and one of the most mystifying for an American who doesn't happen to live in Dade County, Florida. It's absolutely astonishing what they're often said. There's something in the air over the Straits of Florida that causes people to go crazy. It's as good as any other hypothesis that I've heard. Now, we're in Canada, and I want to say that in thinking about having dinner with our two Jorges last night, and thinking about this, I realized that the isolation of Cuba, it's the word that comes to mind to me, the isolation of Cuba, the persecution of Cuba, if you take that point of view, the punishment of Cuba, if you take a certain other point of view, looks a lot different here. Cuba probably doesn't look isolated at all. In fact, as we were moving in February, our mover told us that this year on vacation he was going to Camagüey. And I said, Camagüey, Cuba? He said, yeah, I've been there every year for the last 5 years on vacation and so on and so forth. And I knew this up here, but I hadn't really appreciated that Cuba had already long since become another island in the sun, a very attractive island in the sun for Canadians. In fact, our first trip to Cuba, that is David Welch, Janet Lang, and myself, we flew out of Montreal, and we waited for the Cubana plane under a sign that said, "Come to Cuba. It's a lot cheaper than staying home." And now that I've moved to Canada, I'm beginning to appreciate some of the wisdom of that comment. A couple of things. One has to do with the past. The Cuban past is so dramatic, so romantic in certain ways. Even if you leave Che Guevara out, Fidel Castro is one of the most interesting characters of the 20th century. To what extent can Cuba come out from under that? To what extent can Cuba begin to play the role that one would have expected it to play if this individual had not appeared on the scene, if certain features of the late 1950s and early 1960s had not presented the opportunity to become, in a sense, a little bitty superpower with a real attitude issue, with a kind of heightened and intensified ability to be offended by all kinds of things, particularly things from Washington. And as George says, Washington is the greatest ally that Fidel Castro and the Cuban regime has ever had. To what extent can they become normal and feel right about it? How can the psychology of a Cuban ever be normal? And I'm talking here about Cubans on both sides of the Straits. In the present, we were going to Cuba a lot, every few months for a while, during the early years of the special period in time of peace in the early 1990s. We saw friends of ours losing weight, officials in the Central Committee who literally couldn't keep their clothes around them very easily. It was desperate. But they made it. But they made it by doing something that they had never intended to do, which was to reinstitute tourism as the major feature of the Cuban economy. Many Cubans would echo the words of the poet Pablo Romano Fernandez, who once said that Cuba was the whorehouse of the Western world, and that the great thing about the revolution was that it changed all that. But anyone who's been to Cuba since the touristifying of the island realize that there is a price to pay. There is a moral price to pay, especially against the background of what was said would never happen. But to survive, it has happened, and it's once again it's the greatest attraction in the Western Hemisphere as far as the winter months are concerned from this part of the world. I can't help but ask about the future. People have been asking about the future of Cuba for 50 years. George knows this, and Dave and Janet know this, but Paul Nitze, the primary author of National Security Council Memorandum 1968, wrote a memo to Eisenhower in the late 1959, giving the Cuban regime 6 months, tops, at the outside. In other words, Fidel Castro and his people would make it into the middle of 1961, and that would be it. Of course, then there's the Bay of Pigs in early 1961, for which the Cuban regime was extremely grateful because it completely unified opinion on the island about the United States and about the regime. But what about the future? What is going to happen finally, when Raul leaves the scene, when Fidel is no longer the, I saw him referred to recently as the Blagomante en jefe. That's what he's been reduced to, but his brother is still running things. What will happen? Is it possible to conceive even now of something that's been on the front burner and the back burner off and on for almost my entire lifetime, and far greater than the lifetime of many of you out there, which is a major conflagration in the Caribbean? Could something get out of hand? Is the tension, is it imaginable that one could see a set of tits and tats and so forth that, and if there is, how would we avoid it? How could that be avoided? It seems so odd to even think about it now, but I think until George explains why it's impossible, I'm going to continue to worry about that sort of thing. Finally, I just want to say about George. I'm calling him George because that's what we call him back where we come from. We met George in I'm a believer in documents. I have the document, George. I met George at the Harvard Faculty Club somewhere in around October of 1987, on the 25th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or roughly there. We had a conference at Harvard, at the Kennedy School. Janet, Dave, and I were all involved in it. And it had nothing to do with Cuba, it had nothing to do with Cubans. And in fact, it struck me as peculiar when my advisor, Joe Nye, said, I should go talk to this guy Domínguez in the government department because he knows a lot about Cuba. My response was, why do I have to know about Cuba? It's actually the Soviet missile crisis. This is misnamed. It's about Soviet missiles on this empty island where people dance and play baseball. And that's about it. He actually met me, and he bought my lunch, and explained to me that the Cubans had a very, very different view of the situation, and that whenever I thought of Cuba, I should not think Soviet. And I can't think of any single piece of advice that wore as well throughout all the years we've been going to Cuba and dealing with the U.S. foreign policy toward that region as in the advice to not equate Cuban communism with Soviet communism, because it just ain't true. George is the greatest authority on that island, on or off the island, and I think it's a wonderful thing that you're here, and it's a wonderful thing that we're here to welcome you.
Somehow being introduced twice is not something that I had expected, but thank you. My wife calls me George. You are entitled very much so as well. Let me say two things. There are many great things about Jim, Janet, and Dave. They're married to each other. It was deliberately stated. But one of them is very much this conversation to which Jim just referred, which I don't know whether it was for his good or his bad, but it did change how he shaped much of his work in the years that followed. And thanks to that change, I also learned many things about Cuba and its international relations that I didn't know before. Let me just address briefly the question about the future. I mentioned some about my guesses of the Cuban future. The Cuban future is always a good thing to discuss because Anybody can say anything. It hasn't yet happened. But my guess, one of my guesses, is that the nature of the political regime would not change much, or certainly would not change much very quickly. Another guess about the future is that it is a political regime that has begun to have a number of modest changes. And I mentioned a couple of examples, like letters to the editor, which authorizes public criticism, not of everything, but of some things, or changes with regard to homosexuality, and the role, the importance of treating people, regardless of sexual orientation, as citizens with rights, and to train police officers to say homosexuality is not forbidden under the laws of Cuba. You may not arrest someone who is gay. Or if someone steals a chicken, that it is not an aggravating circumstance that that person may be homosexual. This is very different in a country that in the mid-1960s would send people on what were called the appearance of being homosexual to labor camps under military officers for 2 years. Or that in 1980 deliberately picked up people who seemed to be homosexuals and put them on a boat headed north across the Straits of Florida. So this is a very big deal in that particular society, not just on its own terms. But there are other changes that are thinkable. Take Cuban National Assembly elections that I characterized accurately as not being an example of constitutional liberal democracy because there's only one political party that can act lawfully, and the number of candidates equals the number of seats. But elections for the Cuban National Assembly count all votes. And for reasons that have never become entirely clear, Cuban electoral law insists that at every district, Cubans would have to vote for characteristically 2 people or 2 to 5. So there may be, you and I may be living in a district, there are 2 slots and there are 2 candidates. But that means you actually have a limited choice. Not a big choice, but a limited choice. You can vote for both, and that is the official recommendation. El voto unido, the united vote. But you can vote selectively. You can vote for candidate A, but not for candidate B. And that would be, I wouldn't call it opposition behavior, I wouldn't call it dissident behavior, but I certainly would call it non-conforming behavior. That's not what the Communist Party wants you to do. Moreover, you can go vote and vote blank. Or you can go vote and deliberately void your ballot. So I'm not counting absentees. You could fail to show up at the polls for any number of reasons, and it's hard to tell them apart. But if you vote selectively, or if you vote blank, or if you void your ballot, all 3, in my view, can be characterized as variations of non-conforming behavior. And in the last National Assembly elections, some 2.5 years ago, over 1 million Cubans cast non-conforming ballots. Remember, population of 11 million, it's about 1 out of 6 or so, 1 out of 7 of the electorate voting. That's a lot of people. This is not the old Cuba where everyone was afraid to express a view or to engage in a behavior that was not approved and where only 100% unanimity was in case. So there is a change. And my guess is that if there were a little bit more room, that there would be others who would behave in non-conforming, lawful fashion in this way. Last example, there are easy changes that the existing Cuban government could enact within its own constitution, within its own rules, within the fundamental structures of the political regime. And so I'll just give you one more illustration with regard to the electoral laws. Cuban electoral laws say that for the National Assembly, the number of candidates equals the number of seats, but the candidates are free to campaign. So you can go around and you can answer questions from constituents, you can indicate how you would behave, in effect, campaign promises and the like. At the municipal level, Cuba is now gearing up to municipal elections in another couple of weeks or so. Municipal elections, the law requires that for every post there must be at least 2 candidates. You cannot nominate yourself. You have to be nominated by a process that is controlled by the Communist Party, but there must be 2 candidates, and they may not campaign. So you could imagine keeping the same process nomination, still controlled by the Communist Party, but that would permit 2 candidates for the National Assembly, and that would permit campaigning for municipal candidates. Not a big change, but it would create a kind of possibility for competition within parameters that should make those who are governing Cuba still comfortable enough. Not a big deal, but it is a thinkable thought. And it's those kinds of thinkable thoughts rather than fantasies about a Cuba political regime dramatically different from the present, which every once in a while one can think about, but it's not very likely between now and the time those of you who are students would get your degrees. Which, note, I'm saying that's soon.